issued to the same person. So it's
Right, I would,
anyways.
and the
it's not
argument would
relevant.
be, it just depends on the kind of relationship that's being represented. If it's a different relationship, it's a different kind of relationship, I would consider it a different type of identity document.
I have a general question. I mean, the motivation is quite clear in the sense, that identity theft seems to be a growing problem. The one thing I wasn't so clear about is what prior academic research has, happened in this area.
Really, you mean prior academic research related to identity theft?
Or is there not being done yet?
There has actually a lot of identity theft related research has taken place. I talk about it a lot in the document, in the XP document itself. I don't talk about it a lot here, but to answer your question, yes, there has been a lot of research, mostly in the last 10 years or so, but even going back before then. But the majority of it is in the last 10 years. There's been research done, if you're thinking of the kinds of research, there's been research done related to, for instance, medical identity theft, financial identity theft. There's been research done with regard to trying to develop appropriate legislation or regulation to try and manage identity theft. Very recently, April this year, there was a presidential task force was appointed to investigate identity theft and means of controlling the problems, and that report was just issued, as I say, in April. So yeah, there's been a lot of research on identity theft.
The important thing is, how does your approach
That's
different from-
That's, I guess, what I was
Right.
trying to
My approach is rather than trying to control the problem at the source, at the people who are perpetrating the identity theft, my approach is to look at evaluating the credibility of the document that's being provided and what the potential is that that document is fraudulent. Actually, the next definition that I have here, when I talk about potential fraud, what I'm looking at is whether a person presenting the document, whether the document actually represents the holder. If it does, then there's a potential for identity fraud. I'm not looking at the security of the document. I'm not looking at the controls over how a person, what sort of, how a person opens a new account, for example. I'm doing research that looks at the potential for fraud in a given identity document type. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
You'll be focusing more, looking at it more from the organizational.
I'm looking at it more from the organization making an assessment of the identity documents that it's receiving and assessing actually how credible those documents are, those document types.
And has there been prior research in that direction?
Looking at, to my knowledge, no, there hasn't been research done regarding the credibility of the document types.
When you say organizational, do you mean intra-organizational or intra?
I mean I should specify, thank you, I'm talking about intra-organizational. There has been research done intra-organizational. I'm going to talk a little bit about, especially for this, that this is actually I see this as part of an inter-organizational network, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But the research that has been done has been intra-organizational primarily.
So maybe looking at the account opening process, something like that?
Yes, exactly. There's been a little bit of research done inter-organizationally, but not specifically related to identity fraud.
Just to clarify, you are working on the identity prevention, not the identity detection, or fraud detection.
I guess
Or maybe you want to
argue
isolate
over
the
the
liquid.
words. No, that's fine because it's good to make it clear. I'm looking at recognizing the potential for fraud when an identity document is first presented to the organization.
Okay.
So,
So in that way, both prevention and detection.
yes, there's a little bit of both. That's why I hesitated on answering your question. It's a little bit of both.
Okay.
Will you elaborate a little bit more on the properties of this inter-organizational network?
Yes,
Either now or later.
I'm going to do that later. Yeah, would you, if you don't mind, we can wait until then. Just to make the point about the object of my research here and the definition of potential fraud of an identity document type. I realize that I should have your identity document type. I left out the word type. I'm sorry.
That's the domain.
It's working. It is.
The security of it.
Perfect timing.
Was that planned?
By the way, are you just in Canada? I met
Yeah.
different ideas.
Maybe, and my research will help you to answer that
Don't
question.
resemble that.
One of the things that I thought about in trying to define potential fraud related to identity document types is it fraud if you change your own facts? So for example, if I have a medical identity and I change the facts on there that to make it seem as if I don't have tuberculosis. That's my document, but now I've changed the facts so that the facts on the document don't represent me. Is that potential identity fraud? For my research, the answer is yes. Because the point is that the fact that the information doesn't represent the holder, that means that there is potential for identity fraud. And that's what I'm looking at, is the potential for identity fraud. And again, that's related to an identity document type, not the specific instances of an identity document. The contribution that I see for this research, the main payoff here is I want to be able to provide guidance for organizations on how they set policy related to identity documents. In other words, to give them some guidance on setting policy for what document types are likely to be most credible, meaning have the lowest potential for identity fraud. I see that as the payoff. But in addition to that, a couple of other things that I think will come out of the research related to that payoff is I want to be able to provide a specific tool to be able to predict identity fraud risk for new document types. And I'll talk about that more with my model, but based on assessing the credibility of known identity document types, then we should be able to predict credibility of new kinds of identity if we can find what those credibility factors are associated with the new document type. And that would be useful in practice, again, for users, regulators, law enforcement people. But I think there's also a theoretical contribution here, because this is a new application of a technique called the repertory grid technique, which I'll talk about in more detail. But it's a theory based on a theory in psychology for getting to understand how people see things that you might talk about. In my case, credibility. What do you think of when I say credibility? What does that mean to you? And I'll be eliciting this information from the people who deal day in, day out, the experts, as it were, or at least the experienced people who deal with assessing identity documents.
Okay, can I ask you a quick question? There's an assumption with this research that the document is credible, correct? So if the issuing institution issues a document, then you're going to assume that it's credible.
No, actually my research is going to give you a tool for assessing whether or not the document issued by a particular institution is credible. That's what I'm working towards, is a way of assessing the credibility of that particular document.
So you're going to assume that it's neither true nor false?
I'm not going to assume either way.
Okay.
I'm going to be looking for those
You're talking about
elements.
credibility across a dimension, not a yes, no.
Credibility.
Credibility index.
Yes, a credible, right. It's not a matter of is it credible or is it not correct. It's a matter of how credible is it. What is the potential for identity fraud? Is there a low potential, a high potential? And remember, I started out by saying that there's no way to give you an exact measure of that. I'm looking to give you an heuristic, a rule of thumb for assessing where on that scale the credibility